I was there in the dead of night, watching this 19-year-old girl get out of bed as if nothing had happened. 5 minutes earlier, she'd been having seizures, a sky-high fever, unconscious for 3 days. The prison doctor had just left the infirmary shaking his head, muttering something about nothing more to be done, and then, out of nowhere, Helena opened her eyes, looked directly at me, and said in a serene voice, "Thank you for taking care of me, Mark," as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if miracles happened every day in that God-forsaken place. But let me rewind and tell you how I got to this life-altering moment, because this story didn't begin that night. It began much earlier, the day I first stepped foot in that maximum security prison, carrying a rage I thought would never leave me. My name is Mark, I'm 42 now, but at the time of this story, I was 38. I was a broken man, you know, broken inside, bitter, full of resentment towards everything and everyone, especially God. I was an atheist, but not one of those calm atheists who simply don't believe. I was the type who made a point of destroying any trace of faith I found. It was as if the hope of others deeply bothered me. I'd ended up there because of a car accident. I won't go into details, but it was a moment of carelessness that cost dearly, very dearly. Guilt gnawed at me like acid, but I transformed that guilt into anger. Anger at the world, at circumstances, at that invisible force some people call fate and others call God. To me, it was all just pure cruelty, meaningless chance. Cell 17 was my new address, a concrete cubicle with bars that creaked whenever the wind blew hard outside. The sound of those bars became the soundtrack of my existence. I shared the space with 3 other men, each carrying their own burden of regret and resentment, but none of them were like me. I had a personal mission to disenchant anyone who still had a spark of faith. There are no heroes here, I used to say loudly, so that all the inmates in the other cubicles could hear. There are no miracles, no redemption, just broken men paying for their mistakes in a world that makes no sense. My voice echoed through the corridors like a plague, spreading discouragement and skepticism. I became known as the most dangerous atheist on the wing. Dangerous not because I was violent, but because my words had the power to extinguish the last flicker of hope still burning in the hearts of some of my fellow inmates. It was in this scene of utter darkness that I met Helena. The first time I saw her was during one of those rare moments when we were allowed out of our cells to get some sun in the inner courtyard. She was sitting in a corner, alone, with a book in her hands. She was 19, but her eyes seemed to hold an ancient wisdom. The other inmates called her the Virgin, always in a tone of respect mixed with curiosity. She never spoke much, but there was something about her presence that drew attention, a serenity that violently contrasted with the atmosphere of tension and despair around us. I remember perfectly the first time I decided to provoke her. She was crossing the yard to attend the literacy classes that took place twice a week. I couldn't contain myself. I got up from the table where I was playing cards with other prisoners and shouted loudly, "Look at the saint passing by," spouting nonsense while real life bleeds outside. The other inmates reacted in different ways. Some laughed, others were visibly uncomfortable. There was a silent respect for Helena that I couldn't understand at the time, but she simply lowered her eyes for a second, then raised her head and continued walking. Her lips moved in a whisper I couldn't hear, but there was a peace on her face that irritated me deeply. How could someone maintain this calmness in a place like that? I spent weeks trying to break that serenity. Whenever I saw her, I'd fire off some acidic comment about religion, about the uselessness of faith, about how God had abandoned us all in that hole. But Helena never responded, never reacted with anger or sadness. She just continued with her chores, always with that calm look that made me even more furious. The days dragged on in a monotonous routine. Wake up, drink watery coffee, be locked in the cell most of the time, go out to the yard for a few hours, go back to the cell, sleep, and start all over again the next day. But I noticed that Helena had a different routine. She woke up earlier than everyone else and remained in absolute silence for about an hour before the guards began their first round. I discovered this because I've been insomniac forever, and in the early mornings I would watch the movements in the corridor. One day, curiosity killing me, I decided to peek to see what she did during that silent hour. That's when I saw Helena praying for the first time. It wasn't that desperate prayer I'd seen so many times in my life, people begging for miracles or asking to get out of difficult situations. It was different. She seemed to be talking to someone, as if she had absolute certainty that she was being heard. Her hands were together, but relaxed. Her face radiated a peace I had never seen anywhere. It bothered me in a way I couldn't explain. How could anyone find peace in a place like this? How could they believe in goodness after committing crimes serious enough to land them in a maximum security prison? These questions gnawed at me, but I always pushed them away. I couldn't give in. My disbelief was my armor, and I couldn't allow it to be pierced. Weeks passed, and my obsession with Helena only grew. It wasn't romantic attraction. It was something far more complex. It was as if she represented everything I had lost and couldn't recover. The ability to hope, to believe things could get better, to find meaning amidst the chaos. I wanted to destroy that in her because I couldn't rebuild it in myself. Then, the event that changed everything happened. A riot in the yard. It started with a fight between two rival groups but quickly escalated into widespread chaos. The guards lost control, and what should have been a simple brawl turned into a full-blown war. Tables were smashed, chairs flew, men ran back and forth unsure if they were fleeing or attacking. I tried to get away from the chaos, but I was pushed against a broken table. A sharp piece of wood pierced my right shoulder. The pain was immediate and intense. Blood started pouring through my shirt, and my legs went weak. The adrenaline kept me from passing out immediately, but I knew the wound was serious. The yard remained in utter chaos. The guards had called for backup, but they still couldn't control the situation. Most of the inmates had retreated to the far corners, trying to protect themselves. I was leaning against the wall, pressing on the wound with my left hand, feeling the blood seep between my fingers. That's when I saw Helena. She stood in the middle of the yard, watching the chaos with an expression of profound sadness. Our eyes met, and for a second, time seemed to stop. She saw the blood on my shirt, the despair on my face, and made a decision I never imagined anyone would make for me. Helena started running toward me. It wasn't a desperate run, it was determined. She dodged fighting men, leaped over debris, completely ignoring her own safety. When she reached me, her hands reached for my wound without hesitation. "Let me see," she said in a calm voice that contrasted absurdly with the chaos around us. "It's going to be all right." I wanted to push her away, to yell that I didn't need her help, that I didn't want anything to do with that display of kindness I didn't deserve. But the pain was too intense, and when she gently placed her hands over the wound, I felt immediate relief. It wasn't just physical, it was as if a part of my rage began to dissolve. "Hold my hand," she said, extending her left hand, while keeping her right pressed to my wound. "It will pass." My trembling fingers intertwined with hers, and I felt a warmth I hadn't felt in years. A human warmth, a genuine connection with another human being. There I was, the staunch atheist, who spent his days destroying others' faith, being cared for by the very person whose faith I most tried to destroy. The guards finally regained control, and began tending to the injured. Helena didn't leave my side for a second. She held my hand the entire way to the makeshift infirmary, and even when the first responders began treating the wound, she remained there, in a chair beside the cot where I lay. It was in the infirmary that something happened that shook the foundations of my disbelief. Helena began to pray, but she wasn't praying for herself, she was praying for me, in a low voice, almost a whisper, but I could hear every word. She wasn't asking for a miracle, wasn't begging for my instantaneous healing. She was giving thanks, thanking God that I was alive, that the wound wasn't more severe, that we both had made it out of the riot without worse injuries. "Thank you for protecting him," she said. "Thank you for sending people to care for him. Thank you for him being here, with me." At this moment, I was shocked. Was she thanking God for my injury? No, she was thanking God for my being alive, for surviving, for receiving medical care. She was finding reasons for gratitude in a situation that to any normal person would just be another tragedy in an endless string of tragedies. That was the first crack in my armor of disbelief. I didn't want to admit it, but something inside me began to soften. Maybe it was the physical pain, maybe it was the emotional exhaustion of carrying so much anger for so long, or maybe it was simply the fact that someone had treated me with genuine kindness, without expecting absolutely anything in return. The prison doctor was an elderly man, Dr. Evans, who had worked there for over 20 years. He cleaned the wound, stitched it up, and gave me some pain medication. Throughout the procedure, Helena stayed there holding my hand. At times I tried to pull away, still resisting that display of care, but she held on tight, and said things like, "Calm down, it's almost over," or "You're stronger than you think." When Dr. Evans finished, he looked at Helena with an expression of profound respect. "You saved his life," he said simply. "If he'd lost more blood, or if that wound had become infected before we could treat it, it could have been much worse." Helena simply smiled, and said, "We take care of each other. That's how things work around here." That phrase echoed in my head for days, because until that moment, I had lived by the completely opposite philosophy. Every man for himself, the world is cruel, there's no such thing as selfless kindness, people only do good when there's something to gain in return. But there was Helena, an inmate like me, who had risked her own safety to help me, without knowing my name, without knowing what my crime was, without expecting absolutely anything in return. I spent 2 days in the infirmary recovering. Helena came to visit whenever allowed. She brought an old book, with yellowed pages and a worn cover. It was a book of handwritten prayers, some in Portuguese, others in Latin. When I asked where the book came from, she told me it had belonged to her grandmother, who had been a missionary in impoverished communities. "My grandmother used to say that every prayer in this book was written by someone going through difficult times," Helena explained. "People who found hope when everything seemed lost." She copied these prayers by hand, because she believed that made them more powerful. I should have scoffed. I should have made some sarcastic comment about superstition or magical thinking, but I couldn't. There was something about those yellowed pages, that careful calligraphy, that touched me in an unexpected way. Helena let me browse the book, and I started reading some of the prayers. They were unlike anything I imagined prayers to be. They weren't desperate pleas for miracles or supplications for divine protection. They were profound reflections on the meaning of life, on how to find peace amidst difficulties, on how to forgive oneself and others. Some spoke of inner transformation, of how pain can be a path to spiritual growth. One prayer particularly struck me. It said something like, "Lord, help me to see that my wounds can become windows, that my pain can transform into compassion, that my darkness can generate light for others who are lost." I read that prayer several times, and with each reading it made more sense. That night, alone in the infirmary, I began to think about my life, in a way I hadn't in years. I started to remember my childhood, when my mother took me to church every Sunday. I remembered the stories she told me, the songs we sang together, the feeling of safety and love I felt in those moments. When did I lose all that? When did hope turn to bitterness? The answer came in the form of painful memories. My mother's death, when I was 25, a slow and agonizing death, due to aggressive cancer. I had prayed so much back then, I had pleaded so much for her to be healed, that when she died, I felt as if I had been personally betrayed by God, as if all those prayers had been thrown in the trash. That's when my war against faith began. Not against God exactly, because to wage war against someone you need to believe that person exists. My war was against the illusion of faith, against the false hope it represents, against the empty comfort it offers people in moments of despair. But there in that infirmary, holding Helena's grandmother's prayer book, I began to wonder if I wasn't wrong, if perhaps faith wasn't about being certain that your requests will be granted, but about finding the strength to continue even when they aren't. If perhaps prayer wasn't about getting what you want, but about finding peace with what you have. I returned to the cell on the 3rd day, my shoulder still sore but already feeling much better physically. Mentally, however, I was in total turmoil. All my certainties began to be questioned. All the walls I had built around my heart began to show cracks. Helena returned to her normal routine, but our relationship had completely changed. She continued to wake up early for her silent prayers, but occasionally, she would see me watching and smile subtly. It wasn't a triumphant smile, as if she had managed to convert me. It was a smile of understanding, as if she understood that I was going through a difficult internal process. One night, about a week after the riot, I had a dream that changed everything. I dreamt I was in a prison much larger than the real one, an infinite prison made of invisible chains. The chains weren't around my wrists or ankles, they were around my heart, and each chain had a name: anger, resentment, guilt, despair, bitterness. In the dream, I struggled desperately to break these chains, but the more I struggled, the tighter they became, until Helena appeared. She didn't try to break the chains with force. Instead, she simply placed her hands on each one and said in a soft voice, "Go in peace," and one by one the chains dissolved as if they were made of sugar. I woke up crying. It was the first time I had cried since my mother's death, 13 years earlier. They weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of relief, as if something that had been stuck in my throat for years had finally come loose. I stayed awake the rest of the morning thinking about that dream. I began to understand that my anger wasn't protecting me from more pain, it was preventing me from feeling anything good. My disbelief wasn't making me more rational, it was making me more limited. My bitterness wasn't giving me strength, it was leaving me weak and alone. For the first time in years, I began to consider the possibility that maybe there was something bigger than me, something I couldn't comprehend with my limited logic. Not necessarily the bearded god sitting on a cloud that I had rejected, but some force of love and connection that united all living things. It was in this state of mind that the moment I mentioned at the beginning of this story arrived. Helena fell ill. It was sudden and terrifying. One morning she woke up with a high fever and started having seizures. The guards immediately took her to the infirmary, but Dr. Evans looked visibly worried. He said he had never seen such severe symptoms appear so quickly. For 3 days, Helena was unconscious. Unrelenting fever, intermittent seizures, irregular breathing. Dr. Evans did everything he could with the penitentiary's limited resources, but on the 3rd night, he called me into the hallway and said, "Mark, you need to prepare yourself. I don't think she'll make it through the night." Something inside me crumbled at that moment. It couldn't be. I couldn't lose Helena after she had shown me a way back to life, not after I had finally understood what it meant to care for someone selflessly. I asked the guards to let me stay with her overnight, and surprisingly, they agreed. I spent that dawn beside Helena's bed, watching her fight between life and death. Her breathing was erratic, sometimes stopping for long seconds before resuming with a deep gasp. Her temperature remained extremely high despite all the medication. I wet cloths with cold water and placed them on her forehead, just as she had done for me when I was injured. I held her hand and talked to her, even knowing she probably couldn't hear me. "Helena," I said, "you can't leave now. You taught me that there is goodness in the world, that there is hope even in the darkest places. You showed me that it's possible to care for others without expecting anything in return. I need more time to learn from you. I need more time to become a better person." And there, in that moment of utter despair, for the first time in 13 years, I prayed. It wasn't an elaborate or beautiful prayer, it was simple and direct. If there's anyone up there listening, please don't let her die. Not for me, but for all the people she can still help, for all the light she can still bring to this dark world. If you're watching this video and enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel because I have many other accounts like this to share. True stories of people who have gone through profound transformations and found hope in the most difficult moments. Believe me, you won't regret it. But back to that dawn in the infirmary. After saying that prayer, I felt strangely at peace. It wasn't the peace of someone certain that everything will be all right. It was the peace of someone who had finally surrendered, who had stopped fighting against forces greater than themselves. I continued holding Helena's hand, continued wetting her forehead with cold cloths, but I stopped despairing. It was around 5 in the morning that it happened. Helena stopped breathing. For about 10 seconds, which felt like 10 hours, there was no movement in her chest. I squeezed her hand tightly and whispered, "No, Helena, not now." And then, as if she had heard my plea, she took a deep breath and opened her eyes. But that wasn't all. When she opened her eyes, they were completely lucid. The fever had completely subsided. The seizures had stopped. She looked me directly in the eyes and said, "Thank you for taking care of me, Mark." Dr. Evans arrived half an hour later for what he thought would be the pronouncement of death. When he saw Helena sitting up in bed, talking normally to me, he was shocked. He measured her temperature normal. He checked her blood pressure normal. He tested her reflexes, all functioning perfectly. "This is impossible," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "Last night she was practically in a coma. Her vital functions were failing. There's no medical explanation for this recovery." But I knew there was an explanation. Maybe it wasn't scientific, maybe it couldn't be proven in a lab, but I knew what happened that dawn was a miracle, not the kind we see in movies, with bright lights and celestial music. It was a silent, simple miracle that happened at the exact moment I finally opened myself to the possibility that there are forces in the universe that are greater than my limited understanding. Helena recovered completely in 2 days. There were no after effects, no complications. It was as if she had never been sick. But the transformation that happened in me during those 3 days was permanent and profound. For the first time in 13 years, I began to pray regularly, not prayers asking for specific things, but prayers of gratitude. Gratitude for being alive, for having known Helena, for having had the opportunity to just care for someone the way she had cared for me. Gratitude even for being in that penitentiary, because it was there that I learned the most important lessons of my life. Helena began to teach me about faith in a way I had never experienced before. She showed me that faith isn't about being certain that God will solve all your problems. Faith is about trusting that you have the strength to face whatever problems arise. It's not about getting answers to all your questions, it's about finding peace even amidst uncertainty. Faith, she told me one day, isn't a life insurance policy that guarantees that nothing bad will happen to you. It's a source of strength that guarantees that when bad things happen, you won't face them alone. I started attending the prison's Bible study groups. I, who had spent months mocking any show of faith, now sat in a circle with other inmates, discussing parables and trying to understand messages of love and forgiveness. Most impressively, no one treated me with irony or suspicion. Everyone welcomed me with genuine joy, as if they were happy I'd found my way. One day, the prison chaplain, Father Michael, sought me out for a private conversation. He said he'd heard about my transformation from Helena and wanted to understand what had happened to me. I told him the whole story, from the accident that landed me here to Helena's miraculous recovery. "You know, Mark," he said when I finished, "I've worked here for 15 years. And I've seen many conversions. Some are emotional and fleeting, others are intellectual and superficial, but yours is different. Yours was a conversion of the heart, and those are the ones that truly last." He was right. My transformation wasn't the result of logical arguments or intense emotional experiences. It was the result of experiencing firsthand what it means to be loved unconditionally. Helena showed me that it's possible to love someone without knowing their history, without judging their mistakes, without expecting anything in return. And if an imperfect human being can do that, how much more so a perfect divine force? My relationship with the other inmates also changed completely. Instead of spreading skepticism and discouragement, I began offering words of hope and encouragement. When someone was going through a hard time, I'd sit beside them and say, "I know what it's like to feel lost and hopeless. I've been there, but believe me, there's always a way out. There's always a possibility of a fresh start." Some of the men I had infected with my disbelief in the first few months began to approach me again, curious about what had caused such a radical change. I told my story honestly, without trying to convince anyone of anything, just sharing my experience. Several of them started attending the study groups. Some began to pray, others simply became more hopeful and less bitter. Helena and I became great friends. She never acted as if she had converted me, or as if she were responsible for my transformation. In fact, she always insisted that I had found the faith that already existed within me. She had simply created the conditions for me to stop resisting it. We're all born with a seed of divinity in our hearts, she once told me. Sometimes that seed gets buried under layers of pain, anger, and disappointment, but it's always there, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. I spent 3 years in that penitentiary. They were the 3 most transformative years of my life. When I finally received parole, I was no longer the bitter and angry man who had entered. I was someone who had learned the true meaning of words like forgiveness, compassion, gratitude, and faith. Helena was released 6 months before me. On the day of her release, she gave me her grandmother's prayer book. I want you to have this, she said, not because you need these specific prayers, but because you now understand the power that exists in connecting with something bigger than ourselves. Today, 5 years later, I work as a counselor at a rehabilitation center for substance abusers. Every day I have the opportunity to be with people who are in the same place I once was, lost, hopeless, thinking there's no way out of their problems. And every day I have the chance to do for them what Helena did for me, show them that there's always a possibility of a fresh start. It's not an easy job. Dealing with people who are at rock bottom requires a lot of patience, a lot of understanding, and a lot of faith. Some days I come home exhausted, questioning whether I'm really making a difference in anyone's life. But then I remember Helena. I remember that night in the infirmary. I remember how a simple act of caring can completely change the trajectory of a life. I keep in touch with some of the men I met in prison. Most have managed to reintegrate into society and are leading productive lives. Some have become deeply religious people. Others have simply become better people, more compassionate, and less judgmental. The important thing is that they all found some form of inner peace. As for Helena, we talk on the phone a few times a year. She works for a non-governmental organization that cares for children at risk. When I talk to her, I still notice that same serenity that caught my attention in prison, that same ability to find light in the darkest places. In one of our last conversations, I asked if she remembered that night when she was sick, if she was aware of what was happening around her. She was silent for a few seconds and then said, "I remember everything, Mark. I remember you holding my hand, you wetting my forehead, you praying for the first time in years." At that moment I knew my mission there was accomplished. Mission, that word echoed in my head for days. Was Helena placed in my life for a specific purpose? Was that seemingly chance encounter actually part of a larger plan that I couldn't see at the time? And that's what I try to do for every person who goes through the rehabilitation center. I don't try to convince them of anything. I just try to be a living example that it's possible to start over, that it's possible to find meaning and purpose even after having hit rock bottom. Looking back, I can say with certainty that those 3 years in the penitentiary were the most important of my life. They were the years I learned who I truly was beneath all the layers of anger and bitterness. They were the years I discovered that my true nature wasn't that of a cruel and faithless man, but of someone capable of love and caring for others. If you're going through a tough time in your life, if you're feeling lost or hopeless, I want you to know that your story isn't over yet. No matter what happened in the past, no matter how many times you've tried and failed, there's always a possibility of a fresh start. There's always someone willing to lend a hand and help you get back on your feet. Sometimes that person can appear in the most unexpected places. It could be a coworker you barely know, a neighbor you've never spoken to, or even someone you meet in a difficult situation, like I met Helena. The important thing is to keep your heart open to recognize these opportunities when they arise. And remember,
you can also be that person for someone else. You too can be the instrument a higher power uses to bring healing and hope to those in need. It doesn't have to be anything grand or heroic. Sometimes a genuine smile, a listening ear, a word of encouragement at the right moment is enough. My life today is completely different from what it was 8 years ago when I entered that penitentiary. I have a job that gives me purpose and meaning. I have relationships based on love and mutual respect. I have a faith that sustains me during difficult times. But most importantly, I have the certainty that even in the darkest places, even in the most desperate situations, there's always a light waiting to be kindled. That light can come from outside, through special people like Helena, who cross our paths at the right moment, but it can also come from within, when we finally stop fighting against our own loving nature and allow it to shine. I hope my story has touched your heart in some way. I hope it has shown that it's never too late to change, never too late to choose love over hate, hope over despair, and most importantly, I hope it has shown that we all have the power to be a miracle in someone else's life, just as Helena was a miracle in mine.